Okay, let's try again. That's the beauty of technology, right? So, namaste, and hey, welcome to this. Hopefully the internet will be working fine here. That was really weird why it cut out, but welcome. I'm going to be speaking for the next 20 minutes or 30 minutes or however long people are interested in listening to me. I'm going to be speaking in association with Mind, Body, Spirit festival that's happening at the end of this month, where I am going to be doing a talk and doing a workshop on my two favourite things in the whole wide world. For those of you that don't know me, they are yoga and science, and hence the title in this Facebook feed, Where East Meets West. So I'd like to start just by giving you maybe a little background information that would give you an idea of how I got to where I am now doing what I'm doing. I always think that's a really good way to start, especially with people that I don't know. So basically what happened to me almost 20 years ago now actually, was one day I went to get out of bed and basically my whole body had shut down, like I could not move at all. I couldn't even get off the bed. And at first I thought I'd had a stroke, actually, and then I had to go to the hospital and I had all these tests and they couldn't find anything wrong. I had like MRI scans done on my brain, and x-rays and all of this stuff, and basically what they put it down to was a stress overload, which had caused my mind and body to shut down. And not unsimilar, I suppose, to many people that are tuning in to watch this, but normally it takes the severity of the situation that forces you to really review how you're living your life and how you are looking after yourself or not looking after yourself, or not putting yourself first, not nurturing yourself in order that you can be of service to others. So what was interesting for me was it was my actual consultant that had recommended that I go and try yoga as a way to reconnect my mind and my body. And so I guess, you know, that yoga sort of found me really through having that experience. And we all have these experiences in life, and sometimes we're not actually sure why they happen, but they just put us on a new trajectory. And if you're open and receptive and willing enough to go with that, then, you know, it can take you to amazing places. So I've been teaching now for over 15 years. Been teaching, I trained in a lot of different lineages, but for me the reason I went to yoga was for the mind, and not necessarily the physical activity. And so I'm guessing many people that are now, I can see, tuning in, you may or may not practice yoga, and this talk is, you don't have to be a yogi to understand this talk, but if you are a yogi, you might start to make some comparisons for yourself. So I've been teaching, as I said, for 15 years, a lot of different lineages. But what was really interesting for me was in this journey was I always felt that there was something slightly missing. What I would say is, if you have any comments or you want to ask anything as we're going here, then do let me know. Like post, definitely, for sure. Just like post. I'm just hoping that that everything is working on the internet. So where was I? Yes. Okay. So there was something that was missing, and I didn't really know what it was until I started a different journey, an expansion of the journey that I was already on with one of my teachers, lovely Elena Brower, who coached me for around 11 months actually with the Handle Group in New York. And it was very interesting how that, again, it happened very organically. I hadn't met Elena in person up to that point, but I really connected with the way that she, her teachings, the way that she delivered her teachings, and really saw the possibility to tie in the philosophy of the East and make it more real for everyday life, rather than just the yoga studio, which is obviously, you know, the purpose of those teachings. The purpose of those teachings basically is to do just that, but we sort of tend to leave the teachings in the studio, and then we revert back to our old patterns and behaviours when we leave the studio. So it's this constant challenge for us to find the middle path, as they say in Buddhism, right? So the other thing that was interesting, for me was during this time when I was being coached, I was also going through another major journey, and that was with my mum, who was suffering with Alzheimer's. And so it was a very valuable lesson for me, because while I was going through that process with my mum, I really tapped into what I had learned through teaching and training and studying philosophy, and how to really cultivate that in a real life situation. You know, this cultivating awareness to compassion and empathizing with others. You know, so I'd learned about it, and I thought that I sort of got it, and then I was in a really difficult, challenging position with someone that I cared deeply about, where suddenly all the pieces of the puzzle came together. And what's really interesting with coaching, obviously, is that it works on behaviors. And so through the work that I did with coaching, I was able to understand my behaviors more than just relying on the yoga philosophy or the practice to show me what I needed to be shown. So coaching, if it's done properly, can be another valuable tool from a Western perspective. So during this coaching time and during this journey with my mum, I also started to see a lot of connections, a lot of correlations between Eastern philosophy and Western science, and especially the coaching philosophy, because modern day coaching is actually based on psychological, the psychological foundation. So psychology really underpins modern day coaching. I mean, many of you might not know that, but that's what coaching is basically. So in particular, it was very quick, the correlations in particular with Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, and I speak about this a lot in my classes, that to me, when I was first given the Yoga Sutras many years ago, I just looked at the first few pages and thought, nah, I don't understand any of that, and put it on the bookshelf, and it stayed there for quite a few years until one day I naturally, organically was just drawn towards it. And suddenly, like the first few pages of the sutras, I started to understand more and more. And I think from then on in, making a real correlation with coaching. And I like to think of, one way I describe Patanjali's Yoga Sutras is like a modern day, if you were to translate them to modern day, it would be life coaching. So Patanjali effectively was giving us life coaching 3,000 years ago, but in a different time and a different language. But the essence of what he was trying to say is mirrored now in modern day coaching. So it sort of like goes, we're sort of going full circle, right? We're going through this cycle of life. And the beauty about Patanjali's Yoga Sutras is that obviously he is highlighting the simplicity, that we can find peace and contentment and steadiness in the simplicity of life, rather than the complexity. And I was saying this in a class that I was teaching last night. As human beings, we're wired for complexity. And that's what can lead us into suffering, as the Buddha rightly suggested. And so we're going to speak about this a little bit later again, because it comes up in it comes up again in more Western science with an amazing neuroscientist called Donald Hoffman. So let us move on. I got a few notes here because there's quite a bit that I would like to get through and share with you. So basically, from coaching with Elena and the Handle Group, I then went to I decided to go back to university. So I've been at Cambridge University for the last 2 years. I've studied the psychological foundations of coaching, and I am now studying experimental cognitive psychology and neuropsychology. And that is really understanding the behaviors of people that have damage to different areas of their brain through maybe strokes or epilepsy, Alzheimer's and dementia. And one of these, I've been lucky enough that I've had I've been exposed to a lot of teachings and a lot of studies, but there's two scientists in particular, two neuroscientists that really, speak to me because of the focus of their work is around movement, which is Daniel Woolpert, and consciousness and perception, which is Donald Hoffman. And straight away you can see movement and consciousness right there. That's what we talk about in Eastern practices, yoga, meditation, and mindfulness practices. So you can sort of start to see where I'm going with this chat, and just sort of giving you something to think about as a different way of maybe approaching your practice if you have a yoga practice, or maybe if you're thinking about wanting to start a practice where you can begin to slow the activity in your brain down, not get rid of it, because neurologically speaking, you cannot rid yourself of neural activity. You'd be dead. So, there's a lot of conflicting information and misinterpretations of what it means to still the fluctuations of the mind, as Patanjali refers to in his first chapter, Yogaschita Reti Narodaha. When the fluctuations of the mind are stilled, then there is yoga. But what he didn't actually mean like completely get rid of them. Most of these philosophers and great sages were actually scientists and medics as well. So when we talk about stilling the fluctuations of the mind, in order to reduce the noise in the mind, there has to be a degree of activity to allow that to happen, neurologically speaking, without getting, too detailed. So let's start. I'm going to just make sure that everything is good here. Okay, so let us start with a question, and I'll be interested to see your answers come up. So let's start with a question that Daniel Woolpert asked in a very famous TED talk that he gave a few years ago. And within a few minutes of watching it, I was like, oh my God, this is so relevant to what we do in a yoga class when we are moving from pose to pose in a transition in Surya Namaskar, or whether we're practicing a still practice like Iyengar and there's still movement going on within the actual pose itself. So he asked this question, why do we have a brain? Like, why do we have a brain? And what do you think the primary function of the brain is? So why do we have a brain? And what do you think the primary function is? Now, when he gave this talk, a lot of people started laughing because his answer was, if you think it's to think, then you've been thinking wrong all these years. So he hypothesizes that the only function, the primary function of the brain is movement. And if we, pardon the pun, think about it, nothing can happen without movement. So that leads us on to our next question of how do we as human beings command movement? And without getting too technical again, he proposes predominantly that the brain sends a command to generate a muscle movement, which produces sensory feedback from our environment, enabling us to take action. And then it does something really interesting. The brain does something really interesting. What it then does is it compares the predictions with reality and subtracts them from the sensations to generate the actions. Got it? Sort of? So, you know, we could think about this in any form of a movement-based practice, whether it's Tai Chi, whether it is yoga, whether you're doing a mindful movement, if you're dancing, anything where, you know, you're more aware of movement, because we become more aware of movement when we label it as movement. But during our days, we're just going around, we're just taking it for granted. We don't really comprehend what it takes for us to move around and navigate the world and have conscious experiences. So the other interesting result of his work is that he believes that we actually all move in the same way, but it's in our brains, it's how our brains are encoded that produces the variation of movement from one person to another. And again, you see that a lot in yoga classes. People are, you know, their perception of an instruction can be very varied, and how they then act on the instruction that is coming from the teacher or the guide. And he also says that we have problems in controlling movement, and the problems that the things that can trip us up are the distortion in the signals that we receive back through our senses from our natural environment. And the other thing that really trips us up, and then here is the other link now back to the east, the other thing that trips us up is the beliefs about our beliefs about the world and where we are in it, which we refer to in science as inference. And so he interestingly proposes that our beliefs are represented with a probability that influence and generate our new beliefs. So if you've ever watched The Matrix, then watch it again, because actually what's really interesting is the coding is actually the input that we're seeing. We're seeing the code first, and then that actually forms the picture, the visual representation, but it's actually coded, and then we convert it to a picture or a snapshot on the world. So let's move on, and I'd like you to ponder on this question for a moment as well. And apologies if I'm not answering any questions. I think I'm still having a few technical difficulties here because I can't see if anyone's asking questions at the bottom of my screen, but I'm going to keep going. So stay with me if you if you can. So I want to ask you another question. How do you think we move through life? How do you think we move through life? Questions on a postcard, please. Anything on Facebook as well. So let's just see there. Okay. So, in other words, what do you think the mechanisms are that we use to navigate? Like here, I'm just swinging on my chair, like, and then I might get up and do something else. Then I might go outside, I might walk down the street. I'm seeing, I'm being, I'm getting all this sensory impact. But what are the mechanisms that we use to be able to do all these things? And you know, and now this is where the East and West cross, because they actually are the same, that they talk about the same principles. So how can what are the mechanisms? So the mechanisms are attention, perception, awareness, and action. So if we can define these terms a little bit more, it might give us a deeper insight into when we're practicing meditation and yoga, and how that actually relates to associated brain areas that correlate with these mechanisms. So attention is a mechanism for information. That's what, there's a very brief explanation of that. And awareness is an outcome, which is the conscious state that is linked to attention. And perception is the information that is selected from and ultimately forms the content of awareness. So if we think about that, there's no different whether we're on a yoga mat meditating or going out into the world outside and trying to navigate through life's twists and turns and our interactions with other people. So now let's turn to Donald Hoffman's work, which is around perception, illusions, perception and consciousness, which we could then also tie in from an Eastern perspective, where the Eastern teachings talk about how we are in suffering because we're deluded. Right, we have this, there's all these illusions going on, and in Eastern philosophy and Sanskrit, they refer to that as Maya. So lifting, one of the purposes of yoga and meditation is to lift this veil of illusion that we have about ourselves and the people around us and the world that we're in, and those connections. So that's just, again, it's another very subtle link to an Eastern teaching. So he has a theory called the theory of the interface theory of perception, which is a really interesting way to look at how we see the world and see ourselves in the world from a more scientific viewpoint. And this was in 2015. And he explores the connections between the brain and consciousness experiences, and explains how difficult it is scientifically to really ascertain what consciousness is and how we can measure it, and that we're only now really just barely scraping the surface, and it could be like a major discovery, this work around consciousness and what does that look like in the brain, and how does that show up, and what does it really mean. And so he says that, as well as a lot of other neuroscientists as well, he says that what we see, hear and feel influences our perception, which creates our reality. But he goes a bit further and he questions, if we don't see reality as it is, then how is it useful? Which is another interesting perspective, right? And he then goes on to say that there's a very important distinction to be made here, and that is that reality is not perception. They're two different things, and that the only reason that perception exists is to actually guide adaptable behavior. And as human beings, we have this ability to be able to construct and reconstruct our world, in any given moment. That's the beauty of being human, right? And then he goes on, and again, we're coming back to the Matrix a little bit. So if you don't like the Matrix, sorry, but I think it's poorly acted, but it's a great movie. Because it's almost in that movie like they are stripping away the layers, and all that's there is this code, and basically this is what Hoffman is saying, that everything looks like, everything is coded. The code then gets transferred into a visual form that we can identify with. The brain is so clever. The brain is so amazing. And he describes the relationship between reality and perception like an interface on a computer screen, where you've got all your little, your little blue folders at the bottom, right? And you know what they're there for. and you see the surface, and it's there to serve a purpose, and it's there to give you quick access to what you need, so you can then go out in the world and do what you need to do. You don't need to know about all the electrical components and the coding that goes into this blue folder, and all the detail. The brain takes what it needs in each and every moment for us to be able to do what we need to do without getting too distracted. And then again, we come back to Eastern philosophy. Yoga meditation is about trying to instill this ability not to become so distracted, and to really learn how to cultivate attention. And that's what the yoga practice is about, and this is what he's saying here from a neuroscientific point of view. And so he describes it as the brain selectively processes and evaluates from the incoming information from our environment via our senses and matches it to our immediate needs, what we need to survive in each and every moment. And so that's what gives us this ability to construct and reconstruct our reality. So why then is it so important, do you think, to create and maintain a degree of pliability in the brain? If you practice yoga, with all the pliability and everything around us, there's a heavy emphasis on creating or re-establishing, should I say, re-establishing is probably a better way to put it, re-establishing flexibility back into the body, as well as stamina and strength, clearly. But if we're talking about stamina and we're talking about flexibility in the body, then why can't we use that and apply it to the brain? Why is the body more important than the brain? Actually, the brain is more important than the body in regards to creating and maintaining this flexibility, which is referred to as neuroplasticity in the science world. So it's why should we even bother with that? Well, if you think about it, it's quite logical, really. Because if we're just focusing actually on the body and what we can see and the muscles and trying to get stronger and trying to get flexible, but we're not actually doing this, that's not actually transferring into the brain. So the mind and the body are doing that, but the brain isn't, and vice versa. It can go the opposite way, right? So then surely that starts to create a disconnect. So recent brain research over the last 25 years from a lot of American neuroscientists, as well as German neuroscientists and English neuroscientists, of course, have shown that what brain imaging studies and studies taken from experiments with people that meditate, do certain meditations, shows an increase in cortical thickening, which basically means that it slows down the aging decline, the aging process in the brain. And this is quite big now. You see it everywhere on the internet. There's loads of blogs going up about it. But for the first time in many years, the actual proof, the actual scientific proof is being written up and is accessible for people to see. And again, what it really shows is that what we practice gets stronger, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So obviously, creating pliability, flexibility in the brain is really essential to maintaining good mental health and stability. Can't just be stability, we can't just stabilize our body, we need to also stabilize our mind and our brain, so everything works in conjunction with each other. So, for example, in meditations that are classed as using open focus, if you don't know what they are, they're meditations that predominantly focus more on encouraging people to, and I teach this a lot in my classes, and I'll be doing this at the event as well, is to really tap into sensory awareness in different ways. So some of the sequences I teach are done with the eyes closed. So we're not reliant on our visual input. Instead, we're actually going into the sensory systems of the body. We're promoting sensory awareness. And obviously mindfulness practices are the ones that do that the most, because they you know, it's about paying attention in a very particular way. It's about sensing, it's about feeling. It's not about trying to, you know, get through Surya Namaskar or do the perfect headstand. Actually, it's not all about that at all. It's actually the opposite of that, which is actually to be imperfect is also fine. We can't strive to be perfect all the time, because clearly if we do that, we create stress and anxiety in the nervous systems in the body. So this is, again, just a different way of thinking about maybe what you practice and maybe what you want to practice. So these open focus meditations actually create more brain coherence and slower but more connected brain waves. So it's reducing the interference, it's reducing the noise, it's reducing the fluctuations that Patanjali speaks about. It's reducing those fluctuations. So in Sanskrit, the chittam, this constant whirling of the mind, just slowing it down a little bit, not stopping it, but just slowing it down, regulate. So, you know, slow it down to regulate activity and encourage the different brain areas to fire up and to work together. And that's basically what neuroplacidity is. So the other thing that these type of meditations do, that or movements that are particularly sensory bound to a degree, is that they move us away from particle to wave. And then what that also allows us to do is move away from the normal narrow focus that we have on the world and ourselves and people and places, and instead it shifts the focus onto space. And we can think about space as an ether in the Eastern chakra system. I'm not going to go into that too much here, but I'll be going into that more in the workshop at the end of the month in the festival. So focusing on space, as well as a physical thing that's in space, i.e. meaning me, you, but the space around us. So brain science has also proven that putting attention on our energy is what amplifies our energy. What we practice grows stronger. What we practice grows stronger. And using these techniques of open focus meditation, the brain then is can naturally recalibrate itself by letting go of the analytical mind. So that's the mind the analytical mind over here in the West is the ego in the East. Analytical mind, ego. So the ego we talk about in yoga philosophy as busying itself with forming an identity. Busying itself with forming an identity, right? Me, I. And this sense of space is about slowing that activity and that perspective down to take a broader perspective and to see the wider picture of the implications of you being who you are and the implications that ripple out into the world to the people that you come into contact with as well. So by the brain naturally recalibrating itself and by these open focus meditations, what it also does is it allows us to see how our identity is connected to our environment, how our identity is connected to our emotional addictions and habits as well, and time itself. So the moment you get beyond these elements, you're actually nothing but consciousness. We're all atoms. We're consciousness and space. So let's just touch on two ways of how you can do this, of increasing placidity, this pliability in the brain. And first of all, it's important, I spoke about being imperfect, and obviously we don't want to be imperfect all the time. but it's learning how to be imperfect in a perfect world and being perfect in an imperfect world. That's the analogy that I would like to use. Because the brain can only learn by mistakes. It can only learn by errors. And if we don't make mistakes, then we don't have a baseline which will then help us go out in the world and not repeat necessarily the mistakes that we've made before, maybe not too many of them at least, but to use that as a baseline, use that experience, that learning, to then further our involvement into how we navigate situations and how we navigate life. So repetition is one way to increase this placidity. You know, as I said, what you do grows strong. You know, whatever you practice grows stronger. Repetition is really good for cortical thickening, and that's the placidity. However, there's another part to that equation, and that is we can't just rely on repeating things, especially if we're repeating them wrong and we're not learning the lesson. So there's a real distinction there as well. So the other part of the placidity is basically also learning new things. You know, taking your experience from past memories that you've had and building on that, and then looking at other ways that you can do it. Excuse me. So it's actually this combination of both that will help you not become static. You know, there has to be a degree of fluidity in the brain and the mind and the body. That's what we're practicing through yoga and mindfulness techniques. So what I'd like to do is just touch on the four main mechanisms and the behavioural qualities and the associated brain areas, and possibly link that to some Eastern philosophy, just to give you, again, something else to maybe consider. And this might particularly be helpful to you if you suffer from anxiety or stress. So one of the first mechanisms that I want to talk about basically is improving attention regulation. And that's what we do in a yoga practice. We're trying not to get distracted and wander off. We're trying to keep bringing ourselves back to the point. You know, where are we in our body? What are we feeling? Are we listening? Are we being? And then keep anchoring ourselves back every time that we suddenly become aware that we may be not listening or going to a wrong pose or maybe just flipped out. So improving attention regulation can be also sustaining your attention on a chosen object. And for me, that is like the candle gazing exercise. You know, you sit in front of a burning candle and you look at the wick and you take your attention to that and you just focus on the bottom of the wick, not the flame, but the bottom of the wick. And it cleanses. It's an eye cleanser. Obviously, take your contact lenses out before you do it, otherwise they will just shrivel up and die. But it's that sort of sustaining attention. And that comes from an area of the brain referred to as the anterior cingulate cortex. And that's predominantly responsible for how we task our attention. And if you were with me last month in Cambridge at Cam Yoga, we did the Stroop experiment, which basically tests people's ability, their attention tasking ability. And basically it's how the brain, how fast or how slow the brain works in order to understand a mismatch, i.e. what it's not familiar with and what it has an issue with, colours and words and things like that. So improving attention regulation is super important for that area of the brain. Second mechanism that is relative to practice in yoga is improving body awareness. So if we go to the East, we're looking at yoga and mindfulness practices, not necessarily meditation, but you could class that maybe as a vinyasa or like a physical movement where you're asked to do things and put your different areas of your body, different parts of your body, in different shapes to create a pose. So, being very aware of how you feel in the poses and what's coming up for you. And the associated brain area for that is the insula, which is responsible for sensory awareness. And then the third one is emotional regulation, reappraisal. That's the mechanism. And I'd like to think that coaching is also a facilitator of this, you know, because through coaching in psychology, we're looking at behavior. And we're looking at where the behaviour is coming from as well, what areas of the brain, especially, not so much in psychotherapy, but in psychology and neuroscience, really where that's coming from in the brain. So there's, you know, more brain science in that area. And approaching ongoing, you know, coaching and psychology and psychotherapy and many other, CBT, for example, they all look at emotional reactions in a different way, like what's going on with how you react to things, and is it a reoccurring pattern, and do you want to stop, and do you know you're doing it, are you aware that you're doing it? And so that comes from the dorsal prefrontal cortex, and that can also, it can really help, like if you are a positive thinker, for example, that can, you know, increase your positive feeling about yourself and the world, and that, you know, it's not all doom and gloom. That can really regulate your cognition emotionally. So that's something else to think about. And the other associated brain area that I would say that is very important in emotion, and we go through a lot of emotions on the mat, is the amygdala. In the orbital frontal cortex, which actually controls our decision making, our emotional learning, our attachments there as well, emotional learning, and also fear conditioning. And it's that area of the brain where people that have anxiety and disorders and phobias, and that's located in that brain area. And then the fourth area, the fourth mechanism that I want to talk about, which is super relative to yoga and meditation, not that all of the others weren't, but this one particularly, and also very relative to Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, is the change in perspective on the self. So introspection through meditation gives us the detachment from the identification with the static self, and that is in the medial prefrontal cortex and in the insula. Those are the associated brain areas that are responsible for those mechanisms. So what does this all mean then, basically? Well, the hippocampus is also a really important brain area. It's where we store our memories. It's responsible for a lot of other things, but predominantly hippocampus is responsible for memories. And so that's from the Western perspective. If we look at it from an Eastern perspective, represented through the psychology behind forward bends, when you're in a forward bend, for example, the psychology in forward bends is when the head is down, that you're revisiting the past. You are acknowledging what has gone before, accepting it, cultivating acceptance, to be able to move into the present. So you're bringing the past into the present to resolve, which is what Gestalt psychotherapy is about, which is what a lot of therapies are about, is trying to bring the past into the present to resolve, so you can enjoy the present and move forward and learn from those memories and experiences, and not keep getting tripped up by them. And as I said before, the brain needs to remember. It's really important that the brain remembers. It gives us a baseline for our future decisions and actions, which are actually located in the first chakra. And then the amygdala is also really important. Obviously, the amygdala controls our decision making, as I said, our emotional learning, our fear conditioning. So that's another area of the brain which is targeted through not targeted is probably the wrong word to say, but is involved in some of these mindfulness practices as well. And as I said, the insula is about gaining a broader perspective on self and the world, and detaching from this static sense of self-identification. So, in conclusion, to wrap up, we could relate the equation in science and psychology of time-space objects with the teachings of the Upanishads. The Upanishads are a very famous context or teachings, which is actually one of my favorites, I have to say. I understood the Upanishads a lot easier than some of the other yoga philosophies. So I just want to, relay a few pointers down. From the time of our birth, we've actually been called to explore the world outside of us. But meditation gives us the ability to be able to explore our inner world, and that's really important to gain a sense of perspective and balance. So yoga encourages you to be as familiar with your inner world of thoughts and feelings, memories and desires and imagination as you are with the outer world. And when you are able to understand and move through both the inner and the outer domains of life with freedom and joy, then you've done it. You've fulfilled the purpose of yoga. And as great as the infinite space beyond is the space within the lotus of the heart. That's a direct quote from Deepak Chopra. So I think that's where we'll end it today. Thank you so much for joining me, even though I had a few technical difficulties, so apologies for that. If you would like to get in contact with me, I do private neurobehavioral sessions on Skype and in person. You can private message me through this through my Facebook page. Actually, just private message me through there. And what else have I got coming up? Oh yeah, I'm doing the Yoga Connects Festival. That's the first weekend in July on the Sunday. So I'll be doing another hour and a half of this sort of stuff, if that sort of floats your boat. So that's coming up the beginning of July. I'm doing a workshop, so my calendar, I'm studying a lot, so my calendar isn't huge right now, but basically Mind, Body, Spirit Festival, I will be out on Saturday 29th of April, doing a talk at 2, I think it is, 2 to 3, and then a workshop from 5 to 7, so you can come and find me there. The next workshop will be at Breeze Yoga in Beckenham Junction, which is about 20 minutes south of Brixton. That's Saturday, May 6th. I'll be doing a workshop on this as well there. And then the Yoga Connects Festival at the beginning of July. And there's a few other things that will be coming up later on in the year and the beginning of next year. But I think that is it for now. I hope that you have found that interesting, or not maybe. I hope I managed to engage your attention for the whole 50 minutes. Somebody messaged me last night and said, "Oh, you're only speaking for half an hour, why can't you do an hour?" And I said, I don't want to bore everybody. I just want to keep it fresh and light, and whatever you take away from it, it's just maybe gives you a different perspective, and that's basically if I can do that, then I'm happy. That's the purpose of spreading these correlations, just to give people a slightly different perspective. So we've been online for 50 minutes. I think that is it for now. So I wish you a good evening. If you want to come and take public class with me, then I'm at Try Yoga Chelsea on a Saturday at 1:30. Try Yoga Chelsea 12:15 on a Sunday. And I will be back in Camden after a long hiatus this coming Monday. My class is from 2 to 3:30 there. If you are South Londoner like myself, then you can find me at Breeze Yoga on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and the information is on my Facebook page, so please feel free to hop over to my Facebook page and connect with me there. Any questions on the neural behavioural sessions or anything else I can help you with, then please let me know. So namaste, have an amazing evening, and thank you for joining me on this beautiful sunny London evening. Namaste.